They told me the color of treason was black, the stark, final shade of the executioner's hood, but in the damp chill of my cell, I learned it was gray. It was the gray of stone walls that wept with a cold I felt in my bones, the gray of the thin gruel they slid through a slot in the door, the gray of a sky I could only glimpse through a high, barred slit in the masonry. It was the color of invisibility, a shade I had worn my entire life, now made manifest in the Emperor's deepest dungeon. My name was Lady Elara of House Vance, though that name was now little more than ash in my mouth. My father, the Duke, was a man whose spine had long ago been replaced by a reed, bending to whichever political wind blew strongest. The current gale was Empress Seraphina, and she had blown me here. She had smiled at me during the Midsummer Festival, a smile as bright and sterile as a physician's blade, and hours later, the Imperial Guard had shattered the quiet of my chambers. The charge was treason, conspiracy with the Western Marches. The evidence was a sheaf of letters, my name signed at the bottom of each in a passable imitation of my hand. I had denied it, of course. My denial was a sparrow's protest against a hurricane. No one listened. My father had sent a single, frantic message, not of support, but of pleading, begging me to confess, to save the family from the stain of my trial. He saw only the consequence, not the injustice. He had never truly seen me at all. I was the plain daughter, the quiet one. My cousin, Elara, who had been raised alongside me after her parents' passing, was the star of our small familial constellation. She was all light and laughter, her beauty a warm, accessible hearth around which everyone gathered. I was the shadow she cast, a creature of libraries and hushed hallways. I did not mind the shadows, they were safe. I had my books, my charcoal sticks, and my diagrams of the city's ancient architecture. I traced the lines of forgotten aqueducts and crumbling bridges, finding a silent, sturdy companionship in their logic and endurance. It was a passion no one knew or cared about, a secret garden cultivated in the neglected soil of my existence. Empress Seraphina had always treated me with a particular kind of dismissive cruelty, the sort reserved for an unsightly piece of furniture. Her compliments were barbs wrapped in silk. "So studious, Lady Elara," she would say, her voice loud enough for the surrounding courtiers to hear. "It is a fine thing for a young woman to have hobbies." The implication was clear. Hobbies were all a girl like me could hope for. Elara, meanwhile, was her pet, a doll to be dressed and displayed, and Elara, in her sweet-natured oblivion, saw none of the venom. She only saw the Empress's favor, a sun she was happy to bask in. Now that sun had burned me. I huddled on the thin straw pallet, the rough wool of the prison-issue blanket scratching my chin. I had been here for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of listening to the drip of water, the distant clang of gates, the scuttling of rats that were my only neighbors. Hope was a dangerous thing, a shard of glass to clutch in your fist. I had let it go. I was waiting for the final summons, the short walk to the block, the swift, brutal end to a life lived in the margins. The Empress had framed me, and in a world built on her dazzling performance, my quiet truth stood no chance. I closed my eyes, picturing the elegant curve of the Emperor's Justice Hall, a building whose foundations I knew were sinking due to a shift in the underground river. An irrelevant, useless fact, like me. The sound of a key, grating in the lock, startled me from my torpor. It was the wrong time of day for gruel. Heavy footsteps echoed, not the familiar shuffle of my usual gaoler. The door swung inward, casting a rectangle of flickering torchlight onto the grimy floor. A man stood there, his uniform crisp and severe. He was Captain Valerius, the warden of the Black Cells, a man whose face was said to be carved from the same stone as the prison. "Lady Elara," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of pity or contempt. It was simply a statement of fact. I rose slowly, my joints stiff with cold. I thought this was it. The time had come. I straightened my back, pulling on the last tattered remnant of my dignity. I would not go to my death weeping. But he did not order me out. Instead, he held up a small, sealed scroll. A message. From the Emperor. The words did not compute. I stared at the scroll, at the stark, unbroken crimson wax seal bearing the Imperial dragon. The Emperor. The Iron Emperor. Valerius. A man as remote and cold as a winter moon. He had ascended the throne 5 years ago after his beloved elder brother Augustus was killed in a riding accident. The court whispered that the light had gone out of him that day, leaving only duty and shadow. He rarely spoke at court functions, his dark eyes missing nothing, his presence a weight that silenced frivolous laughter. Why would he write to me? A condemned traitor, a nobody. For me, I whispered, my voice a dry rasp. You are Lady Elara, the warden stated again, as if it were the only explanation required. He stepped forward, broke the seal with a practiced crack of his thumb, and unrolled the parchment. He did not hand it to me. He began to read. Prisoner, he recited, his voice unchanging. The evidence against you is compelling. The letters detail specific weaknesses in the capital's western defenses. They speak of rally points and supply caches. They are signed with your name. Before I sign your warrant, I ask you this one question. If you were to betray your emperor, why would you choose the western marches? Their cavalry is inferior, their leadership is fractured, and their treasury is barren. It is a foolish alliance. The message is finished. He rolled the parchment back up. I stood frozen, my mind reeling. It was not a message of mercy. It was not an accusation. It was a question, a strategic question, a question that assumed I was capable of thinking, of reasoning. It was the most attention anyone of his station had ever paid me. He was not asking if I did it. He was asking why I would do it that way. I am to record your answer, the warden said, his gaze steady. My throat was tight, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was a test, a trick. The Empress was surely behind it, a final, cruel game to mock my supposed intelligence before the end. Any answer could be a trap. Silence was a confession. A denial was a lie. But the question itself, it snagged on a hook in my mind. It was a puzzle, and I had always been good at puzzles. The Western marches. I thought of the maps I had studied, the histories I had read. He was right. They were a terrible choice for an ally. Weak, unreliable. Anyone with a passing knowledge of imperial strategy would know that. The forger of those letters had been thorough in mimicking my hand, but lazy in their understanding of warfare. Or perhaps they assumed I was as ignorant as they were. I took a breath. The air was stale, but it felt like the first real breath I had taken in weeks. Tell the Emperor, I began, my voice gaining a sliver of strength, that if I were a traitor, I would not be a fool. The warden's expression did not flicker, but I saw a subtle shift in his posture. He was listening. The Western marches are a distraction, not a threat, I continued, the words coming more easily now, dredged up from my years of quiet study. A true conspirator would look to the southern sea lords, who command the trade routes, or to the northern mountain clans, who have a generation's worth of grievances and know the emperor's supply lines better than his own quartermasters. To ally with the West is to choose a broken sword for a duel. It is incompetent, and I lifted my chin, a spark of defiance igniting in my chest, am not incompetent. I finished, my breathing ragged. I had said too much. I had been arrogant. I had sealed my own fate. Captain Valerius simply gave a short, sharp nod. I will deliver your reply. He turned and left, the key grating in the lock once more, plunging me back into the familiar gray silence. But something had changed. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of my own voice and the shape of the Emperor's impossible question. I had been asked to think, and in doing so, I felt a part of myself, a part I thought had died, flicker back to life. I sank onto my pallet, not with despair, but with a terrifying, agonizing flutter of something I had forbidden myself to feel. It was the shard of glass. It was hope. 2 days passed. The gray routine returned, and I began to believe the Emperor's message had been a phantom, a final hallucination before the end. I berated myself for my foolish, defiant answer. I should have wept. I should have begged. I had shown pride. and pride was a luxury a condemned woman could not afford. The hope that had flickered now felt like a burn, a self-inflicted wound. Then, on the third evening, the key turned again. Captain Valerius stood in the doorway, the torchlight carving his hawkish features from the gloom. In his hand was another scroll. My heart leaped into my throat. He unrolled it and read as before, his voice a monotone instrument. "Prisoner, your assessment of the southern sea lords and northern clans is accurate. It mirrors my own intelligence reports. This leads to my second question. The letters attributed to you contain detailed sketches of the Citadel's aqueduct system, marking it as a vulnerability. Describe to me the flaw in the design of the Empress's Arch Bridge, constructed 3 years ago to commemorate her arrival in the capital." I stared at him, dumbfounded. The Empress's Arch Bridge. It was her pet project, a monument to her own glory, a sweep of pristine white marble that spanned the River Argent. It was considered a masterpiece, but I knew its secret. I had spent a month studying the original blueprints in the civic archives, comparing them to the hurried, modified construction drafts. This was a far more dangerous question than the first. To criticize the Empress's bridge was to criticize the Empress herself. This had to be her trap. She was goading me, trying to trick me into committing a new treason of the tongue. My answer? I stalled, my mind racing. What did he want? What did the Emperor want? The first question tested my strategic sense. This one tested what? My knowledge of architecture, my courage, or my foolishness? "I require an answer," the warden said, his patience as thin and sharp as a wire. I looked past him, into the darkness of the corridor, as if I could see all the way to the Imperial Palace, to the cold, severe man who was playing this strange game with me. He read my letters twice, the title had said. No, that was a thought from a story, the title of my life. The Emperor read every letter twice. The warden's words were the first reading. The Emperor's mind was the second. He was looking for something beneath the surface. He was not asking for flattery. He was asking for the truth. It was a risk, a terrifying leap into a black abyss, but my other choice was the certain death of the executioner's block. "The flaw," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "is not in the design, but in the materials. The original plan called for granite footings, sunk deep into the bedrock. It is the same method used for the old Imperial Bridge, which has stood for 500 years. I paused, gathering my nerve. But the Empress's arch was built in a hurry. The court records show the budget was exceeded by the cost of the marble and the statuary. To compensate, they used sandstone for the footings, a cheaper, more expedient choice. Sandstone is porous. The River Argent is notoriously silty, and its current is relentless. In 10 years, the footings will begin to erode. In 20, the bridge will be unsafe. Its beauty is a mask for its weakness. It is impermanent. The warden's eyes, dark and unreadable, held mine for a long moment after I finished. I had just called the Empress's monument a fragile, temporary thing. I had signed my own death warrant, more surely than any forger could. Without a word, Captain Valerius rolled up the scroll, turned, and left. The lock clicked shut. This time, I did not sink onto my pallet. I remained standing, my body trembling, not from cold, but from the violent, reckless act of speaking my mind. For the first time in my life, I had not been quiet. I had not stayed in the shadows. I had described a truth no one else dared to see, and I had sent it directly to the most powerful man in the Empire. I did not know if I had just earned my freedom or hastened my demise, but I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that I was no longer invisible. My life began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. The next morning, the gruel was replaced by a bowl of warm porridge with a dollop of honey. The thin, scratchy blanket was gone, and in its place lay a thick, clean wool coverlet that smelled faintly of lavender. They were small comforts, but in the bleak landscape of the black cells, they were a revolution. They were messages in their own right, answers to a question I had not dared to ask. The letters continued. Every 2 or 3 days, The warden would appear with a new scroll from the emperor. The questions were never about the treason plot again. He asked me about the structural stress on the northern watchtowers, about the acoustical design of the Grand Council chamber, about the forgotten history of the pre-imperial catacombs that snaked beneath the city. They were the questions I had spent my life silently pondering. My answers became letters in return. The warden would bring me a small lap desk, a pot of ink, and a single sheet of clean parchment. "The emperor prefers to read your own words," was the only explanation he offered. So I wrote. I wrote about the way the ancient builders used flying buttresses, not just for support, but to create a sense of celestial lightness. I wrote about how the resonance in the council chamber could be dampened with heavy tapestries, preventing eavesdroppers from hearing secrets in the gallery. I filled the pages with the knowledge I had hoarded like a miser, pouring out years of silent observation. The act of writing, of forming the letters with my own hand, was an act of reclamation. These were my thoughts, my voice, my signature. It was not the clumsy forgery of a traitor, but the precise script of a scholar. In one letter, after describing the masonry techniques of the Second Dynasty, I found myself adding a postscript. "I do not know the purpose of these questions, Your Majesty," I wrote, my hand trembling. "I live in daily fear of your judgment. But in answering them, I have felt remembered, not as a name on a warrant, but as a mind. For this, I am grateful, whatever the outcome." I almost scratched it out, convinced it was a fatal overstep. But I left it. It was true, and I was tired of anything that was not true. The emperor's reply came swiftly. "A mind is a rare thing at court, Lady Elara," the warden read. "They are more often found in prisons, it would seem. My next question concerns the Imperial Mausoleum. It was built for my grandfather, but my brother is also interred there. The design is grand, but it offers no comfort. It is a monument to power, not to grief. If you were to design a place of remembrance, what would it look like?" My breath caught. His brother, Augustus, the beloved heir, whose death had plunged the emperor into his iron solitude. This was not a question about architecture. It was a glimpse into his soul, a wound he was cautiously, carefully, showing me. He was not just reading my mind, he was inviting me to read his. I spent 2 days on my reply. I did not write of grand arches or towering spires. I wrote of light and shadow. "A place of remembrance should not be a vault," I wrote. "It should be a garden. There would be stone, yes, a single, unadorned monolith of dark granite to represent the finality of loss, but it would be surrounded by a garden of white roses, for memory, and willow trees, for grief. There would be a small stream, for the continuation of life, and it should be open to the sky, so that the sun and the rain and the stars could visit. It would be a place that acknowledges that grief is not a door to be locked, but a landscape to be lived in." I wrote from the heart of my own lonely existence, from my own understanding of loss, the loss of a mother I barely remembered, the loss of a father's affection, the loss of my own future. When I finished, the parchment was stained with a single tear that had fallen, unplanned, onto the ink. I let it dry. It was part of the answer now. A week passed with no reply. The silence was heavier than before. The comforts, the warm food, the clean blanket, remained, but the absence of his words was a new kind of torture. I had gone too far. I had presumed an intimacy that did not exist. I had touched a nerve that was meant to remain hidden. The Empress, I thought, must have finally won. She must have discovered our correspondence and put a stop to it. The executioner would be coming after all. One night, I was woken by a noise that was not the warden's key. It was a fainter sound, a scraping from the corridor. I sat up, my heart pounding. This was it, an assassin, sent by the Empress to silence me for good. A quiet, untraceable death in the cells. It was what she should have done in the first place. I scrambled to the back of the cell, pressing myself against the cold, weeping stone. The door creaked open. A figure stood silhouetted against the dim light of a single, hooded lantern. It was not the warden. The man was taller, his frame leaner, and he wore no uniform, only a dark, unadorned tunic and cloak. He stepped inside, and the warden followed, closing the door quietly behind them. Captain Valerius gave me a minute, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent command to remain calm. The visitor raised the lantern, the light fell upon his face, and all the air left my body. It was a face I had only ever seen from a great distance, in portraits, or across the vast expanse of the throne room. It was stark and angular, with a firm jaw and a mouth that looked as if it had forgotten how to smile, but it was his eyes that held me. They were the color of a stormy sea, dark and deep and intelligent. They were the eyes of the man who had been asking me questions. It was the Emperor. He had come, not to a formal audience chamber, not to a courtroom, but here, to my cell. He dismissed the warden with a flick of his wrist, and Captain Valerius retreated into the corridor, leaving us alone. The Emperor of the entire known world and a condemned prisoner, standing 3 feet apart in a squalid dungeon. The sheer impossibility of it made the world feel thin, as if it might tear apart. "Lady Elara," he said. His voice was deeper than I had imagined, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the small space. It was the first time he had used my name. I could not speak. I could only stare, my mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. I sank into a clumsy curtsy, my knees hitting the dirty straw. "Please, rise," he said, a hint of impatience in his tone. "There is no need for that here." I got to my feet, my gaze fixed on the stone floor. To look at him felt like staring into the sun. "I received your design for the garden," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. It was eloquent. I risked a glance at him. His severe expression was unchanged, yet the anger and impatience I had expected were absent. He simply looked, weary and thoughtful. "You were correct about the Empress's bridge," he continued, his tone turning colder. "I sent my own engineers to inspect the footings. They used sounding drills. The core is sandstone, just as you said. It is already showing signs of water saturation." He paused, his gaze intense. "How did you know?" "I study," I stammered, the word feeling small and inadequate. "The archives, I read the plans, I compare them, I look for inconsistencies." "Inconsistencies," he repeated, the word tasting strange in his mouth. "The court is built on inconsistencies, on lies wrapped in ceremony. You see them. Why? Because no one else is looking," I whispered. "They see the marble and the statues. They see what they are supposed to see. I see the foundations, the structure, what holds it all up." A long silence stretched between us. He walked the small perimeter of my cell, his boots silent on the stone. He stopped at the high, barred window, looking up at the sliver of night sky. "My brother, Augustus," he said, his back to me. "He loved to build things, models of ships, little wooden forts. He always said I was better at taking them apart, finding the single piece that, if you removed it, would make the whole thing collapse." He turned back to face me, his eyes shadowed. "That is what I have been doing with this case. With the letters. I have been looking for the one piece that does not fit, and it is you." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Your Majesty? The letters are a clever forgery," he said, his voice low and precise. "But they are not your words. They are full of grand, foolish flourishes. Your words." He gestured vaguely towards the corridor, where my letters must have been kept, "are precise, economical. You use language like a master stonemason uses a chisel. You do not waste a single strike. The person who wrote those letters thinks Treason is a grand drama. You know it would be a quiet, methodical piece of engineering." He had not just read my letters, he had understood them. He had seen the shape of my mind, the very structure of my thoughts. In that moment, I felt more seen, more profoundly and frighteningly understood than I had in my entire life. "The Empress knows of our correspondence," he said, his voice hardening again. "She is displeased. She believes I am toying with you. She has demanded that I sign the warrant, that this farce be ended." A cold dread washed over me, extinguishing the fragile warmth that had begun to grow in my chest. Of course, The Empress would not be defied. She has produced a new witness, he went on. A guard who claims he overheard you confessing the plot to your cousin, Elara, on the day of your arrest. Elara, sweet, oblivious Elara. The Empress would use her too. She would twist Elara's tearful, confused visit into a weapon against me. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It's a lie, I said, my voice shaking with a sudden hot fury. Elara wept and asked me why. She believes I am guilty. She would never conspire with me. I know, the Emperor said simply. He took a step closer, and the space between us felt charged, electric. Which is why this cannot continue in the shadows. She has escalated the game. Now, so will I. He looked at me, his gaze so direct it felt like a physical touch. I am moving you from this cell. You will be held in the White Tower, under my personal guard. You will be given paper, ink, books, everything you need. I want you to write down everything you know about the structural and political weaknesses of this court, not as a prisoner answering questions, but as an advisor. I want you to show me every crack in the foundation. I was speechless. An advisor. He was not just saving me. He was arming me. Be prepared, Lady Elara, he said, his voice a low command. The Empress wants a performance. We will give her one. But the stage will be mine, and the script will be the truth. He turned to the door and knocked once. Captain Valerius opened it immediately. Without a backward glance, the Emperor stepped out into the corridor and was gone. The warden looked at me, and for the first time, I saw an expression on his face. It was a faint, grim look of something that might have been respect. Come, my lady, he said, his voice different now. Your new quarters are ready. The White Tower was a world away from the black cells. It was a single, comfortable chamber, high in the palace proper, with a real bed, a small fireplace, and a window that looked out over the city. It was still a prison, the door was still locked, but it was a gilded cage. True to his word, the Emperor sent books, histories, engineering manuals, collections of civic records. He sent paper as fine as cream, and ink as black as a starless night. And so I wrote. I wrote with a feverish intensity, the years of silent observation pouring out of me. I diagrammed the web of patronage and debt that surrounded the Empress. I detailed the shoddy construction and graft in her numerous vanity projects. I analyzed the political factions she played against one another. I took the court apart, piece by piece, just as he had said. It was not treason, it was a structural analysis. I laid the empire bare on paper, showing him every flaw, every stress point, every crack in the facade. I sent the pages to him every day, and every evening, a new stack of books or a fresh roll of maps would arrive in return. We were having a conversation, the most important conversation of my life, through stacks of paper and the quiet loyalty of his guards. During this time, the Empress's campaign against me reached a fever pitch. Rumors swirled through the court like poison gas, that I was a seductress who had bewitched the Emperor, that I was a madwoman, that my confession was imminent. Elara, bless her frightened heart, was paraded at court functions, her pale, sad face held up as proof of my betrayal. My father, I heard, had taken to his bed, prostrate with shame. The Empress was building a narrative, a grand public spectacle of my villainy, certain that the final act would be my execution. She had no idea that the Emperor was building something far more powerful in secret, a case built not on rumor, but on fact, a structure of pure, unassailable truth. The summons came after 2 weeks in the White Tower. It was not a summons to the executioner's block. It was a summons to the Emperor's private study. I was escorted by 2 of the Emperor's personal Praetorian Guard, their crimson cloaks a stark contrast to the drab grays of the prison. I wore a simple gray dress, the only one I had, but it was clean, and I had brushed my hair until it shone. I walked through the corridors of the palace, corridors I had once scurried through hoping to be unnoticed. Now, courtiers stopped and stared, their whispers following me like the rustle of dry leaves. I met their gazes, my own steady. I was no longer a shadow. I was a player in the game, and I was walking toward its conclusion. The emperor's study was nothing like the opulent staterooms. It was a space of quiet, masculine power. The walls were lined with books from floor to ceiling, not for decoration, but for use. Maps were spread across a massive oak table. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and wood smoke from a low fire crackling in the hearth. It was a room that belonged to a mind, not a monarch, and it was not empty. The emperor stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid, his face a mask of cold fury. Empress Seraphina was seated in a high-backed chair, her expression a careful mixture of concern and sorrow. My cousin Elara stood beside her, looking terrified, her eyes wide and pleading. My father was there too, slumped in a chair near the wall, looking older and more diminished than I had ever seen him. A handful of the emperor's most trusted council lords stood like statues near the door. This was not a public trial. It was a private reckoning. "Lady Elara," the emperor said, his voice cutting through the tense silence, "the empress has brought grave charges against you. She has provided a witness to your confession." He gestured toward Elara. Seraphina gave a sad, theatrical sigh. "It pains me, your majesty. Truly, to think that one of my own ladies, the cousin of this dear girl," she placed a proprietary hand on Lyra's arm, "but the safety of the empire must come first." I looked at Lyra, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than fear in her eyes. I saw doubt. She was beginning to understand that the empress's favor was a cage, not a privilege. "Lyra," the emperor said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "tell us what you heard." Lyra trembled, her gaze darting from the empress to me. I went to her, after the arrest," she stammered. "I asked her why. She was crying. She said she was sorry." "A confession," Seraphina declared, a note of triumph in her voice. "She confessed her sorrow for her terrible crime." "Is that what she said, Lyra?" the emperor pressed, his eyes fixed on my cousin. "Did she say she was sorry for committing treason? Or was she simply sorry?" Lyra's eyes met mine. I gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head. Not a denial, a release. I was not asking her to lie for me. I was telling her to speak the truth, whatever it was. Tears welled in Lyra's eyes. "She just said she was sorry," she whispered. I thought she meant, but she just cried. The empress told me it was a confession." A muscle feathered in the emperor's jaw. He turned his cold gaze on Seraphina. "You have been coaching your witness, it seems." "The girl is overwrought," the empress snapped, her composure cracking for the first time. "The evidence is in the letters, her signature, her plans." "Ah, yes, the letters," the emperor said, his voice dangerously soft. He walked to his desk and picked up 2 stacks of parchment. One was the collection of forgeries, the other was the dossier I had written for him. He held them out. "I have spent the last month engaged in a lengthy correspondence with Lady Elara," he announced to the stunned room. "We have discussed architecture, history, strategy. I have come to know her mind quite well. It is a precise, logical, and deeply loyal mind." He dropped my dossier onto the desk with a heavy thud. "This is her work. This is her voice." Then he held up the forged letters. "And this," he said with contempt, "is garbage, a clumsy imitation, but a telling one." He selected one of the forgeries. "This letter, for example, which details a plan to smuggle enemy agents into the city through the aqueduct system. It is written on vellum from the house of scribe Valerius. Quite expensive, quite rare." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "In fact," he continued, "it is so rare that in the last year only one person at court has ordered it for their private correspondence. I have the palace ledgers here." He picked up a book from his desk. "It was you, was it not, my dear Empress?" Seraphina went dead pale. The mask of sorrow shattered, revealing the raw panic beneath. "It's a lie. The vellum was stolen from my chambers. By her. She is a thief as well as a traitor." "Was she?" the emperor asked softly. "Because Lady Elara has been in the black cells for the duration. The ledgers show you placed the order a week before her arrest." He discarded the ledger, and walked slowly towards her. He was no longer a cold, distant monarch. He was a predator, closing in. You underestimated her. You assumed she was just a quiet, plain little thing. You never imagined she had a mind that I might find interesting. You never imagined I would look past the frame to study the painting. She is nothing, Seraphina shrieked, all pretense of grace gone. She rose from her chair, her hands clenched into fists. A worthless, bookish spinster. You are the emperor. You should be by my side, with a proper empress, one who can give you a true heir, not this architectural drawing made flesh. The room was utterly silent, save for her ragged breathing. She had, in her desperation, said the quiet part aloud. Her fear, her jealousy, her ambition, it was all laid bare. The emperor stopped before her. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words were ice. You will be stripped of your title and your lands. You will be escorted to the silent convent on the Isle of Sorrows, where you will have the rest of your life to contemplate the consequences of your ambition. You are an empress no more. Seraphina stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Then she crumpled, all the fight gone out of her, and sank back into the chair, weeping the ugly, ragged tears of the utterly defeated. The emperor turned his back on her. His eyes swept the room, resting on my father, who looked as if he might faint. Then his gaze found me. For the first time, in front of everyone, his severe expression softened. It was not a smile, not yet, but it was a profound transformation, like the sun breaking through iron-gray clouds. It was then that I found my voice. I took a step forward, my gaze not on the emperor, but on the weeping woman in the chair. You were right about one thing, I said, my voice clear and steady, ringing in the quiet room. I am quiet. I lived in the shadows because you and people like you made the light a dangerous place to be. You called me plain because my worth was not in my face, but in my mind, and that terrified you. You called me worthless because you always knew, that I could see the cracks in your foundation. I took a deep breath, the air of the study tasting of victory and freedom. I am Lady Elara of House Vance. I am a scholar. I am a loyal subject of the Emperor. I am not invisible. And you will never harm me again. I had not shouted. I had not wept. I had simply stated the truth. And it was the most powerful thing I had ever said. My father stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time. Lyra rushed to my side, her tears now for me, for us, for all the lost time. She took my hand, her grip fierce and apologetic. I was no longer alone. Later, after Seraphina had been taken away, and the council dismissed, the Emperor led me from the study. He did not take me back to the White Tower. He led me up a winding staircase, to a small, private balcony that overlooked the entire capital. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The city I knew so intimately from maps and diagrams was spread out before me, a living, breathing entity. We stood in silence for a long time, the cool evening breeze, a balm on my skin. The Empress's arch bridge, he said finally, his voice quiet. I have ordered it to be dismantled. I am commissioning a new bridge to be built in its place. He turned to me, his stormy eyes soft in the twilight. I would like you to design it. I stared at him, my heart swelling. It was more than a commission. It was a restoration of my name, my passion, myself. And the garden, he continued, his voice even lower, the one you described, for my brother. I want to build that too, with you. He took my hand. His fingers were long and warm, his grip firm and steady. It was not the touch of a monarch claiming a subject. It was the touch of a man reaching for his equal. Elara, he said, and my name on his lips was a beautiful, unfamiliar song. I have spent 5 years in a prison of my own making, surrounded by people who spoke but said nothing. Your letters, they were a key. You did not tell me what I wanted to hear. You told me what was true. You showed me the foundations. He looked out at the city, then back at me. I do not want an empress who is a monument. I want a partner, a mind to match my own, a woman who sees the truth, even when it is hidden in stone and shadow. He raised my hand, his thumb gently tracing my knuckles. I am not rescuing you, Elara. I am asking you to rescue me. Marry me. Be my empress. Help me rebuild this empire on a stronger foundation. Tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of profound, overwhelming joy, the end of a long, gray winter. Yes, I whispered. Yes. He smiled then, a true, breathtaking smile that transformed his severe face, chasing away the last of the shadows. He leaned in and kissed me, and it was not the chaste, political kiss of a royal union. It was deep and significant, a kiss of recognition, of homecoming. It was the end of a very long silence. 1 year later, I stood on that same balcony, but now I stood as empress. The emperor, my husband Valerius, stood beside me, his arm wrapped securely around my waist. Below us, the city glittered. Construction was underway on the new Elara's bridge, its granite footings sunk deep into the bedrock, a symbol of permanence and integrity. On the far side of the city, in a quiet grove on the palace grounds, a garden of white roses and willow trees was beginning to bloom. My father, humbled and remorseful, had found a measure of his courage again, serving the emperor with a newfound loyalty. Lyra had found her own voice and married a kind-hearted lord who valued her for her warmth, not just her beauty. We were healing. Valerius leaned down, his lips brushing my temple. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he murmured. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer the hands of a prisoner, but they still loved the feel of charcoal and parchment. On my finger was the simple gold ring he had given me, but beside it was a smudge of ink from the plans I had been reviewing all morning. "I was thinking about foundations," I said, leaning back against him, "and how sometimes you have to tear everything down to build something that will last." He held me tighter, his chin resting on my head. He did not need to speak. We understood each other perfectly. I was no longer the invisible girl, the shadow in the corner. I was the empress. I was a builder. I was a wife. I was, finally and completely, seen. And in the quiet strength of his arms, I knew I was home.